for today, 77. Let's get into it. Deuteronomy 21 to 23. Moses is still going over the rules. And as I was reading today, the thing that stood out to me was these are so specific, right? Um, you know, marriage to a captive woman, um, rights of the firstborn, rebellious children. Um, I wonder if these are sort of Moses expanding on maybe the more significant things that happen at the time, the more frequent things that they're having to deal with, right? Because it's not going to deal with every single sin there is in the world, but it seems to be dealing with stuff that might be more commonplace amongst them as they've as he's known them, maybe the issues that he's dealing with the most. Um, but what I can say is this is all clearly sort of again putting it's like putting guardrails up on a society that already has its own do's and don'ts, and making it more um, I don't want to say civilized because it wasn't like they weren't civilized before, but just reining it in somewhat. Um, and that's pretty much Deuteronomy 21. It's and for the rest of it, actually, to be honest, what to do when there's an unsolved murder, right? How to cleanse the society of that. And again, this sense of sin, and sin is brings death, and thus there has to be a death. And they do they force these deaths, mostly on animals, as a pointer to the ultimate death that's able to remove sin. Um, but then, yeah, it's war. It's a time where you go, a country, a nation, a tribe comes into your area. They defeat you. They take your stuff. They take they take the women and children. Israel suffers this at some point as well. This was just the way of the world at the time. There are rules around if you want to marry one of the ladies that you capture, how you do it. Um, rights of the firstborn. And not just rights of the firstborn, because obviously part of their culture was this idea that the firstborn has certain rights, right? This was the reason why Joseph was upset when he took his son Manasseh and Ephraim to his father to be blessed, and dude crossed his hands, putting his right on the younger, left on the older, and blessed the younger more than the older, because there are certain rules that accompany having a firstborn son. Now, this isn't necessarily forcing that. This is rather putting guardrails around a man with two wives that loves his younger son more than his older son by virtue of their wife, and he loves one wife and doesn't the other. This is protecting the firstborn's rights because he shouldn't be cheated out of that because the dad has a favorite amongst the wives, right? What happens with a rebellious son? The son's supposed to be stoned to death, um, and that carries on. If you see your neighbor's ox or goat, don't ignore it. Don't ignore it if it's going astray, if it's wandering, if it's collapsed on the road. Go and help that your neighbor gets it back. And Jesus would have been alluding to these when he gives the Good Samaritan story, right? But this is part of what they're supposed to do. To ignore their responsibility is considered sin. Um, it goes on to even talk about like don't plant any other crop between the rows of your vineyard, right? This might sound arbitrary, but that speaks to someone who is maybe a bit too greedy, a bit too profit oriented, and as we looked at last time, this society was one that is very careful to not overwork the land or the people, and so no, don't make use of every single square inch of your land because you want to increase returns so much. there's some, don't do that. Don't be so greedy. Don't plow an ox to the donkey because it's cruel to the one. The ox will always be stronger, or more built for this than the donkey. It's an unequal yoking. So don't do that. You know. Talks about making clothes of wool and linen woven together. Again, more a sentiment. Well, I can't say that without with authority because I haven't looked into it, but in context, it feels like it's more the sentiment, right, of excess. Same reason why you don't plant crops between the rows of a vineyard. Um, don't wear cloth made of wool and linen. I wonder if that was a symbol of. I wonder if that was a symbol of excess, like the rich people do for the sake of it. Anyway, and it gives rules around sexual purity. It was important for a woman to be a virgin. It was important in that society, but also in God sort of protecting it in this way. Um, I think it proves that God also wants for, sex to remain a thing of marriage and a woman to be a virgin by the time of her getting married. Um, and then some rules around worship. Um, we get another insight into what happened with Balaam, right? God says, no, Ammonites or Moabites for 10 generations. Now that's something we're going to keep an eye on when Ruth eventually joins the assembly. Has it been 10 generations since then? Um, but, you know, uh, when they hired Balaam, it says the Lord refused to listen to Balaam. He turned the intended curse into a blessing. Now, we've read the story and we know that no curse was uttered. But I wonder if this gives an insight into maybe how Balaam was feeling. And the reason why Balaam was, accosted by the angel, but then also why he's attributed to part of Israel's fall. Um, Whether he intended to curse, it will seem like he intended to curse Israel. Um, but yeah, then it goes on with some rules around war, um, how to personal hygiene effectively, don't leave yourself right in the camp. Have a place outside where you do. Um, the camp must be holy. There's a need for that reverence when they've got God walking amongst them. And this is, again, seemingly what God had wanted to do from jump was walk amongst his people. And so even things like where they relieve themselves becomes important because you have a God walking amongst you. How many of us will clean up the house and bring out the fine china when you've got a visitor coming, just another human being. When you've got God in your camp, the camp should reflect that. Um, and then it talks about not charging interest on loans you make to fellow Israelites. Again, this idea of an economy that's so well distributed, wealth that's so well distributed, and we looked at that when we looked at these sort of economic roles. But an economy that where wealth is so well distributed, you don't need to charge interest when you give a loan. But God putting it in here again just protects that. Um, there was a line, Deuteronomy 23:15, that I wanted to point out. If slaves should escape from their masters and take refuge with you, do not hand them over to their masters. When people make the argument that Christianity is used to control or was used by the slave traders, again, they mutilated it. Because you've got verses like this, right? And again, slaves was very different back then, but even so, you give refuge to a slave that's escaped. You don't hand them back. Whereas wasn't like the predecessor to the police force literally just that slave catchers. How can you use the Bible to back that? You can't. Anyway, that's Deuteronomy 21 to 23. Tomorrow is Deuteronomy 24 to 27. So, God willing, we'll be here. We'll talk about it.